Hello everyone, my name is Jolanta Wolak and I would like to talk to you today about going global with your application, that is. Now, before we dive any deeper into this topic, we might for a moment try to answer the question, why do we even need to bother, right? We wrote this beautiful code, why should we pollute it with some strings in incomprehensible languages? After all, English is understood throughout the world. It has become de facto a standard for any international communication, business, technology. And even if somebody does not exactly understand English, they can use automated translation tools, which are pretty good, right? Granted, you might run into some issues translating sonnets or poems, but math and numbers are pretty much universal, right? You might have guessed here I was being just a little sarcastic. As a matter of fact, string translation is just a small part of what globalization is all about. I would like to give you a few examples to illustrate how we could run into some misunderstandings. Let's start with one small character in a string. A lot of languages use basic Latin alphabet. However, most of them have more than 24 characters. Polish is one of such languages. It actually consists of 36 characters. And the word here on the screen features one of them. It's the second letter. It's pretty similar to A, right? The word here spells pączki, which means donuts. So let's imagine this scenario. There is this one day called Fat Thursday in Polish tradition, when everybody is not only allowed but pretty much expected to indulge by eating large quantities of donuts, pączki. So let's say you order a bunch of them online, thinking you're getting donuts. However, the web application you're using is using the base 24-character Latin alphabet, and what you end up with is paczki, pretty similar, right? Just one letter swapped. However, now this becomes boxes. Not exactly what you bargained for, right? Let's look at another example, this time with dates. So say you want to go on a trip to Paris on a nice, warm day. So you book your trip, you schedule it for August, you're all ready to go. One little problem. You realize that in Europe, it's the day, not the month, that comes first in the date. And so your trip ends up a disaster. Hopefully by now I showed you that internationalizing your application is not as simple as just replacing a few strings. So what is globalization, internationalization, and localization? Basically, globalization is considered to have two components to it, internationalization and localization. And this is, by the way, what the title of this slide tells you. It uses a numeric abbreviation wherein you take the first character and the last character of a given string and replace whatever number of characters is between them with that number. That's how internationalization became INT, 18N. And that's a common term. So what is internationalization? Internationalization is basically a process through which you make your application ready to be used in more than one language and within more than one cultural context. Localization, on the other hand, means that you are implementing one specific language. So you could have an application just written and used in English, and it would still be internationalized and localized if you have the proper structures set up. Another important term to be familiar with is locale. It consists of two parts. The first one indicates what language the user uses. The second one indicates the country or the region. They're not always the same. Locale is a property on the HTML tag and is set just like in this example. That happens obviously on the client side. On the server side, you have a Unix a command that allows you to list all the locales supported by your local machine. Now, when you actually run the locale-a command on your machine, you will see more than one entry for, say, English language in the US. And that third component there is called encoding. And encoding, we have different types. We have ISO standards, ASCII, UTF-8. UTF-8 encoding is what has become the norm for HTML5. Charset is an important setting that you will see in your HTML. And when you're dealing with non-standard Latin alphabet, it's essential. Otherwise, you end up with boxes instead of donuts, right? Now that we got our motivation and our terminology out of the way, let's talk about some tools and techniques used in internationalization. Obviously, translation is a big, important thing that needs to happen. You have to take all your strings that are displayed, all the labels. You have to consider any files that the user might need to download, sometimes even the pictures if they contain text, and all of that has to be translated. You can either do it yourself if you know two languages, or obviously more commonly, a company will be hired, or there are by the hour translation services. There's many options here. Another thing is the technique by which the translation occurs. Usually on the server side in your code, you would use either a key or an English version of a string as that key, and have a flat file in which you store all the appropriate translations, and then at the runtime you would pick up the proper one for a given locale. It becomes a little more tricky on the client side because you don't want to send all the translations there, so you have to aggregate just the translations for a specific language and send them up when the site is loaded. This might seem like a lot, but even with 10, 20,000 strings translated, the upload time for such a file would be small in comparison with a single image. So it shouldn't be a consideration. Cultural and regional differences also have to be taken into account, and we might not always be aware of them. A very simple example, names. We expect everybody to have first and last name, sometimes middle initial, not necessarily. But there are cultures where you will have just one name. On the other hand, there are cultures where it's customary to have 4 or even more names, all of them important. Another regional difference that might come into play, for example, large numbers in Europe are represented totally differently than in US, in the sense that the use of dot and comma is reversed. That might be very confusing. Pluralization, very important topic, because in English it's relatively straightforward. You just use a if-else statement to account for plural version. However, there are certain languages where you can have more than one version for plural, sometimes even up to 6. You have to write a very convoluted logic to handle that. Layout, sizing, and overall text flow on the page. This is also important because there are languages where, when you translate to them, a string becomes much longer than you initially anticipated. Also, there are languages where you read from right to left. That can completely destroy the flow of your page and make people look for important places to click on the wrong side of your web page. With all that in mind, I want to assure you that the problem of globalization has been around for a long time. So there are standards, and there are standard libraries that we can use. One of those is the Locale support data repository. It's the Unicode, Common Locale Data Repository. And here is a complete list of what they address. This has been in use for many years now, and it is used not only in JavaScript, but in Java, in C, in .NET platforms, and it's been around for a long time. There is a good number of libraries that we can use in JavaScript that will take care of these implementations. What do they need to do? They need to deal with things like string comparison because there are additional characters in strings in other languages. You have to consider whether, for example, U umlaut comes before regular U or after when you're sorting strings. There is the issue of formatting numbers, dates, measurement units, currency, pluralization, etc. All of that should be supported by a library that you're using. Here is a list, some examples of libraries commonly utilized for globalization. I also included a couple of links below. There is some interesting comparisons of these tools. Depending on which features you're looking for, you might make your decision based on that. In conclusion, only one thing remains for me to say, and that is to wish you a warm and happy vacation in Paris when you book it next year. Thank you.